Okay, so Biden's farewell address.
Yeah.
Want to understand what it was all about. It's more than just a goodbye. This CNN article we're using for this deep dive, it frames it as a reflection on his presidency,
Oh, yeah.
a warning about the future, and honestly, kind of a bit of a political tragedy.
Yeah, the timing is definitely doesn't help, does it? I mean, you have Biden, he defeats Trump in 2020, only to see him come back to the White House. It definitely adds a layer of urgency, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the article really hits hard on this idea of the bridge presidency that didn't quite pan out.
Right.
Biden saw himself as building a bridge to a new generation, a new generation of Democratic leadership.
Yeah.
But instead, it feels like he bridged two Trump terms.
It's an interesting observation for sure, especially when you think about the historical context. I mean, this article really highlights how Biden, I mean, he was shaped by the 20th century, a more traditional view of American leadership.
Yeah.
And he's departing just as we're kind of entering this new, more unpredictable era.
He's like a relic of a bygone age, watching the world he knew crumble.
Yeah.
And the article connects that to his personal losses.
Yeah.
All the losses that he's experienced.
Right.
It adds this, this layer of melancholy to the whole speech.
Yeah, it does. There is this somber tone, but there's also this thread of hope running through it. Remember that quote? He says, "After 50 years of public service, I give you my word. I still believe in the idea for which this nation stands. A nation where, the strength of our institutions and the character of our people matter and must endure."
It's a striking statement for sure. On the one hand, he's acknowledging the fragility, of American democracy,
yeah,
threats that it's facing. But then on the other, there's this unwavering faith in the American people.
Yeah.
Their ability to protect the ideals, the ideals this nation was founded on.
Yeah. It really speaks to Biden's core belief, in the resilience of democracy, which is something that he keeps bringing up over and over again. But he also makes some pretty stark warnings about the future, particularly under the second Trump administration.
What really struck me was how he connected those warnings to a very specific issue, the concentration of power in the hands of, a select few.
Right.
Especially in the tech industry. He even calls it a rising oligarchy.
Yeah, and that's where he starts comparing himself to past presidents.
Right. Washington's warnings about threats to democracy.
Exactly.
And even Eisenhower's worries about the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, but Biden has a modern twist, right?
Right.
Instead of focusing on the military, he's focusing on the tech industrial complex.
He paints this picture of, social media algorithms,
shaping public opinion,
misinformation running wild, and those traditional fact-checking mechanisms, they're just falling by the wayside.
It can be pretty unsettling when you think about it. It's like, how does this new tech industrial complex affect the very foundations of American democracy?
Right.
He's arguing that this concentration of power, you combine that with the ability to manipulate information at an unprecedented scale, it poses a direct threat to the principles of free and fair elections, and informed citizenry. And ultimately the whole idea of self-governance.
It's almost like he's saying that we've entered a new era of tyranny, but it's not coming from a foreign power.
No.
It's coming from this insidious control of information inside our own country.
And to really get the gravity of that claim,
we
need to compare and contrast this tech industrial complex with, the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about.
Right.
Both of them involve this dangerous concentration of power and influence, but they operate in totally different spheres and they pose distinct threats.
So how are they similar and how are they different? Give us the deep dive breakdown.
Okay. Well, so both complexes, they thrive on this symbiotic relationship, right, between powerful corporations and government entities. The military-industrial complex, it relied on those government contracts and spending to fuel the growth of the defense industry, often at the expense of other societal needs. And similarly, the tech-industrial complex, it benefits from government policies and regulations or a lack thereof that let it accumulate massive amounts of data and, control information flows and shape the whole digital landscape.
It sounds like Biden is saying that the tech industrial complex, unlike the military one, it operates with this level of
stealth.
Yeah, stealth.
Yeah.
And pervasiveness.
Yeah.
That makes it even more insidious. Yeah. It's not about tanks and bombs.
It's about controlling Exactly. The tech industrial complex, it exerts its power through those algorithms, you know. They filter our news feeds. Social media platforms that can be weaponized, spread propaganda, misinformation, and, you know, those surveillance technologies that erode privacy and chill dissent.
And it seems like he's particularly concerned about the impact of all this on, well, the younger generation.
Yeah.
Those who have grown up immersed in this digital world.
Totally.
Almost like they're more vulnerable to, you know, manipulation and control.
It's a really crucial point. The article brings up how Biden sees the decline of traditional media, you know, along with the rise of social media as like the primary source of information. For so many people, as a major factor contributing to this vulnerability.
Yeah.
He's worried about critical thinking skills and the inability to discern fact from fiction.
Yeah.
And that susceptibility to, you know, emotional appeals, misinformation campaigns, all that.
It's like he's saying we're raising a generation that's not equipped to navigate this crazy information landscape.
Right.
And I mean, that's got profound implications for the future of, well, democracy.
It's a very sobering thought. It raises these questions about how do we educate future generations, right? About media literacy, critical thinking, and, you know, responsible use of technology. These are challenges that they go beyond partisan politics, and they need a societal-wide effort.
Yeah. He doesn't really offer many solutions, though, does he?
No, not really.
It's more of a warning.
Yeah.
You know, a call to awareness.
Exactly. But he does connect this tech industrial complex to the rise of economic inequality, which he sees as another threat to democracy. He even compares the tech billionaires of today to the robber barons of the Gilded Age.
Implying that their power and influence are creating this new type of aristocracy.
Exactly.
That's undermining
equal opportunity.
Equal opportunity and social mobility.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he brings up the Gilded Age because it's like this cyclical pattern, you know, in American history, where you have rapid technological advancement, economic growth, but then also widening wealth disparities.
And a concentration
of power.
Yeah.
In the hands of just a few.
And that's exactly the context he's using for these warnings about the future.
It's like he's saying, we've been down this road before.
Exactly.
And we know where it leads.
If we don't
address these imbalances.
So what does he propose? What do we do about this tech industrial complex and the rising oligarchy? Does he offer any solutions?
He doesn't give like a specific policy agenda, but he does offer some broad strokes. He calls for greater transparency, accountability from tech companies, stricter regulations to protect data privacy, prevent the spread of misinformation, and a renewed emphasis on civic education and critical thinking skills.
It seems like at the core, his message is, we need to be having this national conversation about these issues. Yeah.
We need to recognize the threats to democracy and start thinking critically about how to use technology in a way that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
And that's where the listener comes in, right? This address is a call to action, but it's also a call to awareness. He's urging all of us to be informed citizens, to really think about the information that we take in and to demand accountability from those in power.
Whether they're in government or the tech industry.
Exactly. It's a weighty challenge for sure.
It is.
But let's shift gears for a second. The article also mentions all of Biden's accomplishments. You know, during his time in office, it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Absolutely. Despite that somber tone of his speech, he does point out some of his administration's achievements.
He points to the strong economic recovery after the pandemic, even surpassing other countries.
He emphasizes his legislative wins. He claims to have passed more significant legislation than, well, Trump, Obama, or Bush.
That's a pretty bold claim.
What were some of those
Well, he talks about the big pandemic relief bills.
Okay.
You know, they provided financial assistance to people and businesses. And then there's that infrastructure bill that actually had bipartisan support,
right,
you know, aimed at fixing our roads, bridges, broadband. And then there was that legislation focused on bringing back American manufacturing and competing with China, especially with semiconductors.
He also managed to lower the cost of some prescription drugs, which is something that's been
a long time coming.
Yeah. And let's not forget his achievements with foreign policy, particularly the Ukraine crisis.
Oh, yeah. That was a defining moment for sure.
Yeah.
You know, rallying international support for Ukraine, providing that military and financial aid, and, you know, playing a key role in keeping things from getting worse with Russia. It was a delicate situation. And I'd say he handled it pretty well.
But as the article points out, even those successes, they're all kind of viewed through the lens of Trump's return.
Yeah, it's like this shadow looming over everything.
Will those alliances that Biden worked so hard to rebuild hold up? Will America's global leadership role be, you know, diminished? These are big questions.
Yeah, they definitely are. And it's interesting, Biden's approval ratings, they were relatively low his whole time in office.
Right. And the article really dives into that.
That disconnect.
Yeah, the disconnect between policy and perception.
Even if the economy looks good on paper, if people aren't feeling it, it doesn't really translate into political support.
It really highlights the limitations of policy alone, you know, and addressing those deeper anxieties that fuel movements like Trump's.
Yeah. And then there's the question of whether Biden's focus on the working class, you know, a core part of his campaign, actually resulted in any real benefits for them.
Right.
The article suggests that, I mean, despite his efforts, working class voters just, they felt increasingly disillusioned, alienated from the Democratic Party.
It's complicated, isn't it?
It really is.
You could argue that his policies just weren't enough to counter those economic anxieties and cultural shifts that are driving voters towards Trump's brand of populism.
It's possible.
And maybe it's also about messaging. Maybe he just didn't articulate his accomplishments in a way that resonated with voters, you know, on an emotional level.
That's a good point. I mean, in this era, you know, dominated by social media, sound bites, being able to connect with voters on an emotional level, it's become crucial.
Tap into their hopes and fears.
Yeah.
It's almost like Biden, you know, despite his long career and his commitment to the working class, maybe he lacked that I don't know, that intangible charisma that draws people in.
You know, makes them feel seen and heard.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting observation. It really speaks to how political leadership is changing.
In the 21st century.
Exactly. You know, where the ability to connect personally, project authenticity, empathy, it can often overshadow, policy specifics or even, you know, tangible achievements.
So we end up with this picture of Biden leaving office with a mixed legacy marked by both, you know, achievements, but also a sense of unfulfilled potential.
It's a legacy that'll definitely be debated for years to come.
Okay, let's pause here. When we come back, I want to dive deeper into this whole tech industrial complex idea and what it means for the future of, American democracy.
You know, it's interesting how Biden keeps bringing up that warning about the tech industrial complex throughout his speech, really. It's not just a side issue, you know. It's tied in with all his worries about, truth, democracy, the future of America, really.
He seems really worried about young people, the ones who grew up with social media, as like their main source of information.
Yeah.
You think he has a point?
I do. The article points out how that constant flow of information, a lot of it unfiltered, can be just too much. It creates this this feeling of information overload, you know, where it's hard to even tell what's real anymore.
In Biden, he links that directly to the decline of traditional media, you know, the institutions that used to fact check things and give, I guess, a more curated view of the world.
It's like he misses having a shared reality, you know, like a common ground where everyone agrees on the facts. With social media, everyone's got their own little echo chamber. They just keep hearing what they already believe. It makes it so much harder to actually talk to people who think differently.
He even says social media has given up on fact-checking. That's a pretty big statement.
It is. And it shows, I think, how worried he is about truth. in this whole digital age. It's not just talking about lies and propaganda. Like, he's also worried about, well, the sneakier ways that information can be messed with, distorted, taken out of context, just to sway public opinion.
This tech industrial complex, kind of scary when you think about it. This idea that they're controlling what stories we hear.
It makes you wonder, who actually has the power to shape those narratives and what they're even trying to do? Are they, looking out for society?
Right.
Or are they just after more money, more power?
And if we can't even agree on what's true, how can we even have a democracy? How are we supposed to make good decisions about all the problems we face when we're drowning in, misinformation? Propaganda. It's a mess.
That's what Biden's getting at. He's saying that this whole tech industrial complex, it's got so much reach, so much influence, it could really damage the foundation of how our country works.
But isn't this just like how things are changing, with how we get our news? Didn't the media always have biases? And wasn't it always hard to tell fact from fiction?
You're not wrong. Those problems aren't brand new. But what's different now is, how fast information spreads and how these tech platforms can target us, based on what we like, what we do online.
So instead of having a public square where everyone hears all sorts of views,
right,
we're all stuck in these little bubbles
where
we only hear what we already agree with.
Exactly. And that makes it harder to have tough conversations, to really challenge what we believe, to find common ground. It makes everyone more divided, more extreme, and sometimes even violent.
It's pretty bleak. Any solutions in sight?
He does mention some possible fixes. He admits it's complicated, though. He says we need more transparency from these companies.
Okay.
Stricter rules about spreading lies and more focus on teaching people civic responsibility.
Transparency sounds like a good start. If we know how these algorithms work, how they choose what we see, maybe we can be more careful about, what we believe.
He also talks about media literacy, especially for young people. We need to teach them how to look at online information and see the bias, the manipulation, and just be smarter about, what they believe and share.
Basically, be smarter about technology.
Exactly. And that's not just on individuals. It's on teachers, policymakers, and even the tech companies themselves.
These companies can really regulate themselves? Or are they too busy chasing profits and clicks to really care about, the health of our democracy?
That's a tough one. Some people say they're too big, too ingrained in everything now to be controlled. They point to all that data they collect, the crazy algorithms they use, their sway over, what people think as proof that, they've got too much power.
Others would say that government getting involved, it'll just stifle innovation, and mess with free speech. It's tricky, for sure.
Very tricky. But Biden's saying that we can't just sit back and watch this technology change everything, without any rules.
He's telling us to have a real conversation about all this.
Right.
To figure out how to use technology for good, but also limit the damage it can do.
And everyone needs to be part of that conversation.
Right.
Tech companies, lawmakers, teachers, and, all of us.
It's interesting how he ties this tech industrial complex to that other big theme in his speech, the growing gap between rich and poor. He even compares today's tech billionaires to the robber barons of the Gilded Age. What's he getting at there?
It's a strong comparison. He's saying that, back in the Gilded Age, a few people got super rich and powerful, and he sees the same thing happening now with tech. He's saying all that wealth and influence in a few hands, it's bad for democracy. It undermines the idea that everyone has equal opportunities, that everyone can compete fairly.
So, he's saying we're creating a new aristocracy, a tech elite, who don't even care about, normal people.
And that disconnect, that's what leads to policies that only help the rich. The working class, the middle class, they suffer. And that just makes people resentful, divided. They start losing faith in the whole system.
So how do we fix this? How do we stop history from repeating itself?
He doesn't have all the answers. He says we need to rethink how we do taxes, regulations, our social safety nets, create a system where everyone has a chance to succeed, not just the people at the top.
That fits with, his whole call for a fairer, more inclusive society, one that values, opportunity for everyone, shared prosperity. But it also seems a bit at odds with, well, how divided our country is.
You're right. That tension between what we want and what's actually happening,
right,
it runs through a lot of his speech. He's leaving office with this feeling that there's so much left to do. He knows the problems America's facing are really deep. They need a level of, I guess, political will and unity that just doesn't seem possible right now.
It's not the happiest note to end on, but maybe there's some hope in his call to action. He wants us, the listeners, to be active citizens, to get involved in the democratic process, demand more from our leaders.
And that's where we all come in. It's up to us to decide if we go along with, well, this slide back into another Gilded Age, or if we fight for something better, something fairer.
He's saying the future of American democracy, it's in our hands.
And that's a powerful reminder, even with all the uncertainty and worry in the world right now.
Okay, let's let that sink in for a bit. When we come back, I want to talk about Biden's legacy, what he actually accomplished during his time as president. How will history see him? So we've talked about the warnings, the challenges, all that. But let's focus on what Biden actually got done, his accomplishments. The article actually highlights quite a few, even though he only had one term.
It is a pretty impressive list. He oversaw a strong economic recovery after the pandemic. You could even argue that it, exceeded expectations, outperformed other developed nations, in terms of growth.
Yeah. He got those pandemic relief bills passed, the infrastructure bill, which, even had bipartisan support, and legislation to boost American manufacturing, compete with China, especially in semiconductors. And he lowered the cost of some prescription drugs, which is something that's been on the table for years. Yeah. It's funny how many of those policies were, aimed at the working class, a group he's always supported. But the article points out that, working class support for Biden and the Democrats, it kind of went down during his presidency.
Yeah, that's the irony, isn't it? He puts forward all these policies to help them, but they don't seem to, stick with him politically.
Maybe it's just more complicated than that. Maybe his policies alone weren't enough to address, the deeper economic anxieties that people feel and those cultural shifts that have been pushing voters towards, populism, like what Trump represents.
It's not just about policy, though. It's also about how people see things. Even if the economy is doing well on paper, if people aren't feeling it in their own lives, it's not going to change how they vote.
It's that gap between the statistics and what people are actually experiencing. Yeah. And in politics, perception, it's often everything.
Right.
Now, let's look at foreign policy. Biden came in after Trump's first term, which, let's face it, was pretty chaotic on the global stage. He made a real effort to, repair relationships with allies, especially in Europe. And his role in supporting Ukraine against Russia, that was significant.
Oh, absolutely. His handling of the Ukraine crisis, that was, a defining moment for him. He brought the world together, got crucial aid to Ukraine, and, stopped things from escalating. It took real skill and understanding of, global diplomacy and the ability to get people on board, even when they weren't so sure.
But again, the article brings up the fact that, Trump's back. Will those alliances Biden worked so hard to rebuild, will they last? Will America still be seen as a global leader?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? It's almost like Biden's leaving with this sense of unease, like knowing that all the progress he made could just, disappear.
It feels like he's leaving behind this mixed legacy.
Yeah.
He's got a list of real achievements, but there's this feeling that it might not be enough. That the things he's warning us about, they might still win in the end. And
that might be the most impactful part of his speech. It's not just about, listing what he did or warning about the future. It's this plea to the American people to remember, who they are, what they stand for, and to fight for their country.
It's like he's saying, I did my part, but it's not over. It's your turn now.
And that's powerful. Whether people actually listen to him, that's another story.
Makes you wonder how history will see him. Will he be seen as just a bridge between these two crazy times? Or will what he accomplished, will that stand on its own as real achievements during, a really tough time?
Only time will tell. But his presidency, it's been important, that's for sure. His choices have changed things. And we'll be dealing with the consequences for years to come. His speech, with all its warnings and hopes, it's like a final statement of how he sees the world, what he believes in, and his faith in, in America.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. What do we do with all this? How do we face the challenges he laid out? The answer is, well, they'll decide what happens to American democracy.
And with that thought, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Biden's farewell address.
We've covered so much, the historical context, the warnings about, rising oligarchy and that whole tech industrial complex, what he accomplished, the setbacks, and, well, how his legacy will be seen.
It's complicated stuff, but hopefully our conversation, it's given you some clarity, some insights.
As always, the goal of this deep dive is to give you the tools and knowledge so you can form your own opinions and, have real conversations about the things that matter.
Because in the end, the future, it's not something that just happens. It's something we create through our choices, our actions.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What role will you play in shaping the future of American democracy?